Hello again, Eternal Faith family. We're here with yet another virtual Sunday school lesson. I'm excited to continue into our study of Christian apologetics. So kind of this defense of why we believe what we believe as Christians. We're continuing in this kind of series of arguments for the existence of God. These are arguments that attempt to demonstrate that God exists using a number of different methods of reasoning. And as I discussed before, these arguments may not outright convince somebody of the existence of God, but they're certainly useful if somebody ever asks you, hey, Christians believe in God. Is there really any reason to think that there is a God, or do you just believe that based on nothing? But really, we do have reasons to believe. Last week, we discussed the Kalam cosmological argument, one of the many variations of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And this week, we're going to be moving from kind of an argument based primarily on scientific observation and some philosophical arguments. We're moving to the moral argument for the existence of God. And the moral argument attempts to establish the existence of God based on the existence of certain moral values and duties. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I wanted to open up with a quotation from C.S. Lewis, in which he discusses a little bit of his arguments against the concept of God, but then kind of in his understanding of the issue with his atheistic worldview before he converted to Christianity. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust?" And so Lewis understood some of the issues with this worldview, and we're going to talk about them today. But first, to kind of warm up with the moral argument, I would like to play a little bit of a game. I want you to group these statements. All of these are propositions of a sort. The first one is favorite ice cream flavor. So what your favorite ice cream flavor is? Obviously, it has to be Bluebell something, but there can be variations in there. 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is another proposition. There are different kinds of propositions, but they are propositions. A triangle has 3 sides. Okay, that's another proposition. Your favorite color. Okay. Preferred TV show or movie, or even genre of TV shows or movies. And the proposition that there is no such thing as a married bachelor. Now, I'll tell you that there are, you could divide these into further groups, but I think that immediately most people would divide these groups into what 2 categories? Most people would call one of these categories facts and the other category opinions, right? So my favorite ice cream flavor, my favorite color, and my preferred TV shows, those are opinions. Those are things that I hold for myself. They're kind of beliefs that I have, but really they're just preferences. They're not, there's nothing really factual about those statements, whereas, at least further than their description, there's nothing normative about those statements. There's nothing that implies kind of a universal to them. But the statements 2 plus 2 equals 4, a triangle has 3 sides, and there is no such thing as a married bachelor, those are stronger claims, most people would say. Those are factual claims. They're claims that attempt to transcend not just myself. In other words, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not an opinion that I hold necessarily. That is to say that idea is larger than me. There is no such thing as a married bachelor. That is a kind of a metaphysical proposition there that because of what it means to be married and because of what it means to be a bachelor, those two things are exclusive. You cannot have them both. So these are ideas that are a little bit deeper than my favorite ice cream. So whereas my favorite ice cream refers and only has to do with me and what I think about ice cream, and my favorite color about me and my favorite colors, or my TV shows, these other claims, these factual claims, are bigger than me. They apply to everyone at all times and all places. For example, 10,000 years ago, or whatever, however far back you want to go in the past, we can go to all the way to Jesus. Guess what? 2 + 2 = 4. Still true. Triangles have 3 sides. Still true. There is no such thing as a married bachelor. Still true. So those things are true regardless of who they're referring to, and regardless of the time in which those statements are. Now, let's play this game with some moral propositions. Now, these are series of propositions, and I want you to kind of sit there and think to yourself, are these right or are these wrong? So the first one, a student lying to a teacher about an assignment. Okay, right or wrong? All right, okay. A soldier courageously saving their friend in combat. Stealing from the poor. Maybe somebody who's struggling and yet all of their possessions are taken away from them. How about abuse? Right or wrong? Generosity? Right or wrong? Showing mercy or compassion. Torture of the innocent. Slavery. Now, odds are, all of you were probably able to kind of determine whether or not these things were right or wrong pretty quickly. You probably didn't have to think about these things much. These are pretty straightforward, pretty simple moral propositions, and you kind of know whether they're right or wrong. Now, let me ask you a question. For the moral questions or propositions that we just talked about, are those just opinions? Or are those kind of objective facts? So remember the exercise that we did right before, where we categorize things into kind of a set of opinions and a set of facts, or objectively true things versus subjectively true things. So objectively true things are those set of facts that we talked about on the first slide. Those are things that apply to all people, at all times, in all places. Whereas these subjective facts kind of, well, it depends on all of these things. Right? So my favorite ice cream color depends on who I am. It depends on ice creams and what I've tasted, right? All of those things it's dependent on. But 2 + 2 = 4 is not dependent on anything. It doesn't depend on when you lived or where you lived. 2 + 2 = 4 is always true. So, which category do moral propositions fall under? Are they opinions? Is it just, well, it's my opinion that torture of the innocent is bad, but maybe you have a different opinion than me? Or is it something more like, there is no such thing as a married bachelor, where it's true regardless of whether or not people kind of agree or disagree with it? Well, that brings us to the moral argument for the existence of God. Once again, it is 2 premises and a conclusion. The first premise is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore, God exists. Now, this argument follows a very well-known logical structure It's called modus ponens if you want to look it up. It's just, the argument is valid, meaning that the logic of the argument flows in such a way as if the two premises are true, then the conclusion follows from those two premises. So the only question then is, or modus tollens, that's the logical structure, is modus tollens. Now, the only thing that remains is the question of whether or not these two premises are in fact true. So the first premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So if there is no God, what determines what is right and wrong? Morally speaking, is it just majority opinion? Do we just rely on whatever most people think is right or wrong? Is that what determines what is really right and wrong? What about evolution? Can evolution explain the origins of morality or the foundations for morality? There's a lot of reasons to be very skeptical of both of these opinions. The majority opinion issue becomes quite relevant, considering that the majority opinion throughout history has changed quite often. So, for example, a few hundred years ago, slavery wasn't just not morally wrong; it was actually morally right. So how do you deal with that, right? We don't want to say that, well, just whatever the majority of people believe, that's what's morally right, because now you're having to deal with, well, now we have to explain why there was slavery. We have to explain all sorts of terrible acts in history because the majority opinion thought that was correct. And we can't just say, well, the majority opinion is always right. In addition to that, you run into problems with trying to reform society, right? Because the idea of reform is, this is how society functions, this is the majority opinion, but it's wrong and we should change it. But if what defines what is right and wrong is the majority opinion, if you're in the minority, you are by definition wrong. Therefore, you can never reform anything. So most people don't want to found all of objective morality on majority opinion. What about evolution? Well, it's actually quite interesting. Most evolutionary theorists outright say that evolution does not provide an objective moral standard. There's a very, very famous evolutionary theorist named Michael Ruse, and he makes the point that if you rewound the evolutionary clock, it's very likely that different moral values and duties would have emerged on a different kind of train of evolution. We would have evolved with a different set of morals. That actually implies that those morals that we do have, according to evolution, would be not objective, that they would be subjective, that they would be dependent on kind of how things evolved. So it's actually quite interesting. Most people, or at least a lot of people, will agree with the first premise, that if God doesn't exist, it becomes very difficult to base what right and wrong is in the world. There are very few things that you can actually point to say, this is the foundation of what is right and what is wrong. There aren't many other things to turn to. I mean, it seems that morality, as we talked about earlier, is larger than just your opinions. And we'll talk about that now as we move into the second premise. But what else, what other than God could ground all of morality or kind of provide a foundation for it? Majority opinion or society doesn't seem to offer that answer, and neither does something like evolution. So, do objective moral values and duties exist? This is the second premise. Well, as we established earlier, all moral values and duties are either objective or subjective. Objective, again, meaning that they are concrete fact, that it is a fact that abuse is wrong and generosity is right. That it is an objective fact that torture of the innocent is wrong. Or You can interpret them subjectively or relatively, where you would say something like, well, based on American culture and society, it is the opinion of the Americans that torture of the innocent is wrong. But really, there is nothing objectively the case that is wrong or right about torture of the innocent. It's just an opinion that people have. In the same way that my favorite ice cream, being pistachio almond ice cream, doesn't really transcend me. It doesn't go beyond me. It's just my thoughts and my opinions. Are moral values like that, or are they facts? Well, there's a number of reasons to think that they are factual. Firstly, our exercise earlier probably demonstrates that many of you have an intuition as to what is right and wrong, just intuitively. And your intuition tells you that these things are not just kind of right and wrong in a kind of opinionated sense, where you say, yeah, it's my opinion that torture of the innocent is wrong. It's my opinion. But instead you want to put your foot down and say, no, those things are right and wrong. Like objectively, regardless of my thoughts on it, regardless of anybody's thoughts on it, it's right or wrong. So your intuition tells you that these things are substantial, that they transcend a little bit just opinion, but that they become fact. Moral propositions are facts. Another issue that you run into if you say that all values and duties and such, all of morality is just subjective, is that you can no longer arbitrate between different value systems. So for example, you can't say that what anybody else did is wrong. You can say that you disagree, or that it annoys you, or that it displeases you, or that you wouldn't do it that way, but you can't say that they were wrong, because it's just their opinion. But do we do that with, like, murderers? Or suppose that we convict somebody of being a serial killer. Notice that the argument against the serial killer is not, well, the rest of society just is of the opinion that we just don't like what you're doing. It displeases us. That's never what it says. That's never what anybody says. It's that they were wrong for doing so. It's that a serial killer it's not just that everyone is offended by them and that people don't like what they're doing, but they're entitled to their own opinions about whether or not it's okay to kill people. Nobody ever says that. But instead, what do people say? They say that they were wrong. I mentioned it earlier, the reformer's dilemma, which is an issue that you run into if you say that objective moral values and duties are subjective. You can run into issues there because depending on what you're basing subjective morality on, again, if it's just a majority opinion like we talked about earlier, then the minority is always by definition wrong. The minority can never be correct in any. So if 55% of people believe that murder is right, and 45% of people believe that murder is wrong, the 45%, in virtue of being in the minority, are wrong. Period. That is what it looks like to base morality on majority opinion. And you say, but what if you advocate and then convince people? Well, if you were really a committed moral relativist, you would have to convince people of by your own admission, your wrong opinion, until it was the majority opinion, and then all of a sudden it became right. That's how it works. But that seems absurd. No reformer in the history of, ever has said, hey, right now we're wrong, but if enough of you agree with me, we'll be right. But instead, they've looked at society and said, although society believes this is really what's right. But all of this implies that there is an objective standard that people are pointing to. That they can take this example, murder, for example, or slavery, and that they can compare it with something and say, this, slavery and murder, doesn't line up with this, these moral principles and rules. That this over here isn't good, whereas this over here is, maybe generosity, charity. And so the conclusion of the argument is, therefore God exists. Now, rewind to the argument again in summary. If there is no God, then objective morals don't exist. There aren't any. But our intuitions, our intuitions tell us that really there are objective moral values and duties. Our experience in life, nobody lives their life as if morals were just opinions. Nobody does. Nobody. I mean, really. Everybody lives their lives as though morality is a fact, or questions and issues in morality. Now, we can debate about what those facts are, sure. And people do all the time, right? We can pick any social issue you want, and it's a question of, is this morally right or wrong? But nobody's taking an established moral principle and saying, yeah, it's just not for me. And you should be okay with that. It's just my opinion to disagree. Nobody does that. When the Holocaust occurred, nobody said, that's just the Germans' opinions. We just disagree. It's fine, though. It's just their opinion. Right? When slavery was occurring, nobody just kind of shrugged and said, it's just their opinion. But the only thing that we can really found these moral principles on seems to be the existence of a God. A God who himself authors morality. And moreover, I would say actually, God himself provides what it means to be moral so that we can actually, kind of as that C.S. Lewis quote at the beginning pointed to, our idea of morality comes from God. The only reason that you can identify things as good or bad is because you're able to compare them to who God is and what God says. And so, this argument, it's very old. It's a very old argument for the existence of God. But essentially, to kind of summarize the argument in very simple terms, is that if you want to affirm that moral principles are facts, then you have to provide some kind of real foundation for that. You can't just take all of morality for granted and just be like, yeah, just all of these moral principles and ideas they're just real. I don't really know where they came from, how they got there, or anything like that. You have to provide some sort of basis for them. And if you want to do that, there aren't many options for it. We mentioned a couple earlier, but they're not great. And so it seems, though, that if you want to commit to an objective standard of morality, you need the existence of God to build upon. Now, as we're wrapping up this argument, it is important to note that this moral argument is not a question about how people act, right? So for example, atheists can be perfectly moral people. As a matter of fact, most atheists I know are perfectly moral people. It's not a question of, well, if you don't believe in God, you will never act rightly. That's not the issue. The issue is, if God doesn't exist, how do you explain morality? Like, foundationally. Like, sure, me and you might agree that murder is wrong, me and an atheist, but what is their explanation for why? I can say, well, The reason that murder is wrong is because it contradicts the nature of God, and God is the standard of what is right. And the atheist just has to say, well, murder is wrong because, murder is wrong. But what is their foundation? What is the basis for their belief that murder is wrong? As a Christian, you can point to the commands of God, you can point to the nature of God. But as an atheist, man, that's a tough position to be in. What makes charity right and abuse wrong? What makes murder wrong? What makes generosity and courage right? That's a tough thing to do on an atheistic worldview. That is a tough, tough thing to do. So, don't tell your atheist friends that they can't be good people. That's not the argument. They probably are and oftentimes will continue to be great people even though they're atheists. It's just that they have a difficulty explaining why things are right and wrong. It's a problem with their worldview, not their actions. So I hope that this was somewhat helpful, the moral argument for the existence of God. I hope that this was helpful to all of you. I really enjoy getting into these arguments for the existence of God. This will probably conclude our arguments for the existence of God. A number of them, I might do one more. We'll see if people still want me to do more arguments for the existence of God. I will. But a lot of the rest of them get very technical, philosophical, and theological, and I don't really want to get into that just because it bogs us down in very theoretical stuff. Not to say that it's bad, but a lot of people don't want to hear that. So all of that being said, I hope that this has been a blessing to you, this argument for the existence of God. I hope you've learned a little bit something about morality, and I hope you are better prepared to kind of answer that question of, how do you know, do you have any reasons to really believe that God exists? And so I hope that these two arguments will aid in that. I'd ask you now to please bow your heads in prayer with me as we conclude. Dear Lord, we do thank you for today, God. God, I thank you for the opportunity for us to come, Lord, to learn about you, God, and your impact on everyone's life. God, that you are ultimately our standard of goodness. And Lord, we thank you for that. God, we thank you for graciously sharing yourself with us so that we can attempt to live moral lives. And God, I pray that we would better be prepared as those who go to make disciples to give an answer for what we believe and why we believe those things. Lord, we thank you and we love you. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.
Hey everyone, we'd like to start by thanking you for being here with us. We're so glad you decided to join us in our worship today. For more information about us, visit our website at www.eternalfaith.org. If you have questions, please feel free to give us a call at 512-272-4043 or drop us an email at office@eternalfaith.org. Looking to make a donation? You can give to Eternal Faith in several ways. On the church website at www.eternalfaith.org and just click on Give in the menu bar at the top. The Secure Give app on your phone, or you can always send it via U.S. mail to Eternal Faith Baptist Church, 12720 FM 973, Manor, Texas 78653. Please join us Sundays at 10:45 in person or for a live stream. Can't make it at 10:45? No problem. You can always watch online anytime. Just go to the website at www.eternalfaith.org and click on Watch Sermons in the menu bar. If you have questions, please feel free to give us a call or send us an email, or better yet, join us in person. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can subscribe by hitting the Eternal Faith logo in the center or by hitting the subscribe button below this video.